Okay, let's get started. So until now, for the vast majority of everything we've been doing, we have been working with numbers primarily, right? As much as I keep on trying to claim that programming is not related to math, it seems like everything we do is numbers. That being said, we are now going to move along to some other things, although we're not going to leave numbers high and dry. We actually alluded to this before, the concept of a string, which is basically working with words and letters and characters. So as you know, to print, let's say, the number 2, I say P2, and that prints the 2 to the screen. If I wanted to print a word, let's say hello, what I do is I would have to take the word hello in quotes and print that. What happens if I don't use the quotation marks?
You'll get an error.
I'll get an error because Ruby will say, error on line 1, undefined local variable or method hello. I have no idea what hello is. But if you do put the hello inside quotation marks, then Ruby recognizes that whatever is in the quotation marks is what is called a string. A string is a valid piece of information. Just like a number is a valid piece of information, so too a string is a valid piece of information. Now, if I wanted to write a program that printed out some words that didn't actually include the quotation marks, because that's sort of weird. Let's say I wanted to say, welcome to my program. It would be nice to write that without the quotation marks, even though in my code I have to use quotation marks to indicate that it's a string. To do that, Ruby actually comes with another type of printing keyword called puts, or just to call it puts. And that will print the string to your terminal. However, it will omit the quotes when it actually prints it. So that's a prettier way to print a string in a program. Any questions about that? Straightforward? Okay.
Does it have to be just single double quotes, or can it be single?
Great question. So Kay wants to know, I use double quotes, can it be single quotes? And the answer is it can be single quotes, although we'll see shortly there is a slight difference between when you use double quotes and single quotes, but just one slight subtle difference. But yes, you could use single quotes. However, you must make sure to use the same thing on both sides, right? What happens, let's say let me just lop off. Let me just put one single quotes on the beginning and nothing at the end. What do you think will happen? I get an error message. However, the error message that I get is quite not clear. It doesn't say, hey, you're missing the end of your string, you're missing a quotation mark. It says unterminated string meets end of file, which is a very fancy way of saying that your string keeps on going and it doesn't end. And we reach the end of the file without seeing the termination, the ending of your string. Does that make sense? That's how you read that error message. Now that will happen even in this situation where I start the string off with the single quotes and end it with the double quotes. That still causes the same problem because Ruby is still looking for the end of my string that started with the single quotes and never found the closing never found the reciprocal single quotes to close that string. Does that make sense? That is an error you'll get a lot because it's very easy to forget the end of a string, the end of the quotes. Or it's easy to mismatch quotes. Okay, however, pretty much for the duration of this, I will usually demo with double quotes. Again, you'll see why in a bit. Okay, let's do this. What do you think will happen when I run this? Catfish is a reasonable guess. So you can actually, quote unquote, add strings together this way. The official term for that is concatenation. Coincidence to the fact that there's a cat in there. If I did dogfish, that's also concatenation. But you can call it adding strings. Now what happens if I do this. It's a good guess, but I actually get an error. Ruby does not let you subtract a string from another string. It could have, but that's another example of how we see programming languages often can be arbitrary. The designers of Ruby decided, yeah, you can add strings together, but we're not going to let you subtract them. That's just how they made it. Okay, now here might be one of the trickiest things about strings if you're not used to it. What happens when we add the 12 string with the 12 string? Yeah, we got 12, 12. Because since it's a string, even though when we look at it, we see numbers, Ruby does not treat it as a number. It treats it just as a series of characters, just like a word. Just this word happens to have numbers in it as its characters rather than letters.
And it would do the same thing if you have 12 under the quotes?
If I put 12 plus 12 under the quotes, you mean a new line here?
No. I'm saying like if you remove the quotes on the end of 12, the first 12 and the beginning.
Like that?
Remove, yeah.
That's going to be like that. That's one long string. Yep. So it would be incorrect to say that a string is like a word, because it doesn't have to just be alphabet letters, right? It could be alphanumeric characters. It doesn't have to make sense, right? That's not a word in any language, but it counts. It's a string. Ruby doesn't care whether it makes sense. A string is simply a series of characters in a row. And the way we indicate a string in Ruby is by surrounding it with quotation marks. Strings pretty much exist in every programming language that I'm aware of. Any questions about this? Okay. This is a little lighter, right, after all that heavy calculation stuff. But don't worry, we're going to get back to the heavy calculations just momentarily. One more thing I want to demo to you, and this also throws people for a loop when they first see it, is that you could stick variables in the middle of your strings like so. Let me start over here. So I'm going to make a variable called x, and x is going to be a string called Fred. So just like variables could be a nickname for a number, variables can also be a nickname for a string. Now, I can do this, and that looks a little weird. Let me show it to you, and then we'll digest it. So there's this very interesting syntax here with the pound sign and curly braces. Now, when you put that pound sign and curly braces within a string, you're basically telling Ruby that anything that you find within this curly braces, don't treat it as the actual string, as the actual characters. Treat it as code. And since in my code I have a variable called x, Ruby is basically sticking in my variable in there. And since when I say the variable, remember a variable is simply a nickname for something. So when I say x, that's a nickname for the string Fred. Ruby is essentially inserting the string Fred right there. So when we print that, we see hello Fred in the terminal. This process of sort of inserting a variable or some like code inside your string, there's a fancy word for it. It's called interpolation. And this actually brings us to that one subtle difference between a string that is surrounded by double quotes versus a string that is surrounded by single quotes. When you're using a string surrounded by single quotes, you are unable to do interpolation. This little thing here, this little trick of inserting some Ruby into the middle of your string, only works with a string that is surrounded with double quotes. So that's why in all my examples going forward, just to make it so I could do interpolation, I'm always going to be using examples with strings that have double quotation marks. Just to show you what would happen, if I used single quotation marks here, then Ruby would print that literally. Ruby only treats that little pound sign curly brace thing as code as if the string that it's within is a double quotation mark kind of string. That is the only difference between strings with single quotes versus double quotes, but it's a significant difference because interpolation is something you often do. In fact, we're about to do it in an exercise. Let me just show this in one more example. I'm going to make x be 100. What is going to happen? So before, x was a nickname for a string called Fred. But now, x is a nickname for a number. It's the number 100. What happens when I run this code? Yeah?
I think as long as you have puts, then it'll react to the class that you have x as. So instead of it being text and string, it's like an integer in its case. So I think it'll plug it in properly.
Yeah, so Shane is right, it plugs it in properly. But this is weird, right? X here is actually a raw number, right? But however, when you do interpolate a number into a string, basically Ruby just sort of like treats it as a string as well, just meshes it with your string. So the result to the terminal is that it prints hello 100.